In this story, I'm going to tell you a riddle. But let me say this from the start. It took people a full 74 years to find the answer to this riddle. Think about it. A person is born, grows up, grows old, dies, and even they might not live to see the answer. Picture a man lying on a beach at sunset, stretched out on the sand. He's wearing a smart suit, his shoes polished like new, as if he were on his way somewhere, as if he had an important appointment, but no one even looks at him twice. Just some drunk, people think, and walk on, not noticing that he doesn't even flinch as mosquitoes buzz around his face. The next morning, the man was still there, but he wasn't sleeping anymore. There was no ID in his pockets, no wallet. Every tag in his clothing had been carefully cut away, as if someone didn't want him to be found. One by one, meticulously, patiently, and months later, tucked into a hidden pocket in his trousers, a tiny, tightly rolled scrap of paper was found. On it were just 2 words in an old, distant language, printed with an almost artistic precision. Finished. Who was this man? Why did he die? Who had erased every trace of him so carefully? And that scrap of paper, what exactly was finished? A life? A secret? A mission? Now close your eyes and listen to my voice. I'm going to tell you the story of the Somerton Man. Fair warning, even by the end of this story, not everything gets solved. It was around 7 in the evening on November 30th, 1948. In the south of Australia, in the seaside suburb of Somerton Park near the city of Adelaide, the air was still warm and a sea breeze drifted slowly over the sand. It was the start of summer. People were out for their evening walks along the beach, children playing in the last of the light. Jeweler John Bain Lyons was out for a walk with his wife. Heading toward the suburb of Glenelg, they noticed a man leaning against the seawall, about 18 meters away from them. He lay with his legs crossed, arms stretched out beside him. He raised his right arm into the air, then let it fall back slowly, as if he were trying and failing to smoke a cigarette in the clumsy way of a drunk man. The Lyons couple took it as an unremarkable scene and carried on. Coming across drunks on the beach was hardly unusual in those days. Half an hour later, another couple saw the same man in the same position. This time they looked more closely from above. The man was wearing a suit, his shoes polished like a mirror, hardly beach attire. His left arm was splayed out on the sand. He wasn't moving. Mosquitoes hovered around his face. He must be dead to the world not to notice the mosquitoes, joked the young man in the couple, a faint smile in his voice. His girlfriend laughed. The two of them decided he was simply in a deep sleep and walked on. Neither of them could have known how bitterly true that joke would turn out to be within a few short hours. The next morning, December 1st, just after 6:30, Lyons returned from a swim to find a small crowd gathered by the seawall. He walked over, curious. The man was still in the same position, head resting against the wall, legs crossed as if he hadn't moved all night. But now he was cold. His body lay motionless, stiffened, even in the cool morning air. A half-smoked cigarette rested on his collar as though it had fallen from his mouth without anyone noticing. There were no visible marks of violence on his body, no wound, no bruise, no sign of a struggle, just a man who had died quietly, alone, on the sand. And the people around him, even those who had seen him the evening before, joked about him, laughed about him. None of them knew who he was. The police were called. From that morning on, Somerton Park Beach would become the setting for one of the longest-running mysteries in Australian history. And no one, in that moment, could have guessed just how deep it would go. The body reached Royal Adelaide Hospital about 3 hours after it was found. Doctors placed the time of death no earlier than 2 in the morning. The first assessment was heart failure, but as the examination went on, more and more troubling details began to surface. There was almost nothing in the man's pockets. A bus ticket valid from Adelaide to the beach, a packet of chewing gum, a few matches, 2 combs, and, oddly, a cheap packet of cigarettes containing a more expensive brand inside, as if the man had hidden his preferred higher quality cigarettes inside a cheaper pack. There was no wallet, no cash, no identity card, no letter, no photograph, nothing. Stranger still, there wasn't a single label in his clothing. The manufacturer's tags had been carefully, deliberately cut out, with one single exception, as though someone had sat there for hours, one by one, patiently erasing every trace of themselves. One of his pockets had been neatly mended with an unusual orange thread. It was noted that this thread was of a kind not commonly found in ordinary tailors or shops, as if someone were saying, "Do not recognize me," and had deliberately destroyed every mark that could identify him. When the full autopsy was carried out on December 2nd, the police had already exhausted every lead they had, and the autopsy, far from clarifying anything, only deepened the mystery. His pupils were described as smaller than normal and unusual. A trail of dribble had run down the side of his mouth. According to the reports, he had likely been unable to swallow. His spleen was roughly 3 times its normal size and had hardened. His liver was swollen and congested with blood. His stomach contained the remains of his last meal, a pasty, and an unexpected amount of blood. All of this pointed to poisoning, yet nothing suggested the poison had been in the food itself. The man's strange behavior on the beach, raising and lowering his arm, then lying still, no longer looked like drunkenness, but the slow, gradual effect of some kind of poison working through his system. But here's the strange part. An expert chemist tested his blood and organs again and again, meticulously, and found no trace of any poison whatsoever. At the 1949 inquest, the pathologist who performed the autopsy, John Dwyer, admitted, unable to hide the astonishment in his voice, "I was astounded that he found nothing." In the end, an official cause of death was never determined, not in any way, not ever. On paper, this man had died of an unknown cause. Science, even having examined his body directly, could offer no answer. There were other oddities about his body, oddities that would send the investigation in entirely new directions. His calf muscles were unusually high and well developed. Even in his late 40s, perhaps close to 50, he had the legs of an athlete, even a dancer. His toes were strangely wedge-shaped, as if he'd spent a lifetime wearing a particular kind of shoe. One expert who testified at the inquest chose his words carefully. "I have never seen such pronounced calf development in any other case. His feet were quite striking. This is my own assumption, as though he'd been in the habit of wearing high-heeled, pointed shoes." "Perhaps," suggested another expert witness with a note of hesitation in his voice, "this man had been a ballet dancer." Adelaide's coroner, Thomas Cleland, now had a genuine puzzle on his hands. A body, but no identity, no cause of death. no reasonable explanation. According to the respected pharmacologist Cedric Stanton Hicks, the only plausible explanation was a very rare poison, one that broke down in the body almost immediately after death, so dangerous that Hicks refused even to say its name aloud in open court. Instead, quietly, he passed the coroner a small slip of paper on which he'd written the names of two possible candidates, digitalis and strophanthin, an extremely rare compound derived from the seeds of African plants, historically used by tribes as an arrow poison. The police took a full set of fingerprints and circulated them first across Australia, then throughout the English-speaking world, from Britain to America, from Canada to New Zealand. No one recognized them. People from every corner of Adelaide, even from neighboring states, were brought to the morgue in the hope of putting a name to the body. Some thought they recognized him from newspaper photographs. Others were the desperate, hopeful relatives of missing persons, people searching for a son, a husband, a brother, having heard nothing for months. Each of them, walking into that cold morgue room, hoped both to find an answer and not to find one. If this man was who they were looking for, at least the uncertainty would end. If not, the search would go on. A few tentatively identified the body, but each time, after careful questioning, the authorities ruled them out, and each time hope was extinguished all over again. The Somerton Man had now officially become the unknown man, and so he would remain for a very long time. By the beginning of January 1949, the South Australian police had exhausted nearly every lead they had. The investigation widened. Perhaps the man had come from out of state. Perhaps he'd left luggage somewhere. Perhaps he'd booked a hotel room. This meant patiently, methodically checking every hotel, every dry cleaner, every lost property office, and every train station for miles around. Ordinary, exhausting, disheartening police work. And this time, unexpectedly, it produced a result. On January 14th, staff at Adelaide's main railway station brought detectives an unremarkable brown suitcase. It had been left in the cloakroom on November 30th, the day before the body was found, and no one had come to collect it since. The station staff didn't remember who had left it. It had looked so ordinary that no one had paid it any attention. The contents of the suitcase weren't especially illuminating either, but they offered at least one connection. Inside was a reel of orange thread, identical to the thread used to mend the dead man's pocket. It was a definite link, but again, almost every trace of the owner's identity had been carefully removed. There were no stickers on the case, no markings. A label had been torn from one side. Only 3 items bore name tags, and all 3 bore the same name: Keen, Keen, or T. Keen. When the police could find no missing person by that name, they arrived at a strange but logical conclusion. Someone had left these tags deliberately, knowing full well that the dead man's real name wasn't Keen. It looked like a deliberate act of misdirection, as if someone were intentionally scrambling the trail. The rest of the suitcase's contents were just as inscrutable: a stenciling kit of the kind used by a ship's cargo officer, the sort a third mate might use to mark cargo, a table knife, its handle cut down and sharpened, a pair of scissors with their points sharpened, and a coat made with an unusual stitching technique. A tailor identified the stitch as American in origin, suggesting the coat and perhaps its owner had traveled abroad during the war, perhaps to America. But once again, a search of shipping and immigration records nationwide turned up nothing. It was as if the man had lived and died without ever once entering the official record. Now growing desperate, the police brought in John Cleland, a retired pathologist from the University of Adelaide, to re-examine the body and its belongings from the very beginning down to the smallest detail. In April, a full 4 months after the body had been found, Cleland's patient work uncovered the most astonishing piece of evidence yet. Cleland noticed a small, almost invisible pocket sewn into the waistband of the man's trousers, so cleverly hidden that every previous examiner had missed it. The pocket seemed designed to hold a fob watch, small, narrow, unremarkable. Inside was a tiny, tightly rolled scrap of paper. When Cleland carefully unrolled it, he found 2 words printed in an elaborate, ornate typeface. Tamam Shud. It would prove to be the strangest, most astonishing piece of evidence found to date. Frank Kennedy, the police reporter for Adelaide's Advertiser, recognized the words as Persian almost immediately and telephoned the police to suggest they track down a book of poetry, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Written in the 12th century, the work had achieved extraordinary popularity in Australia during the war years through the beloved translation by English writer Edward Fitzgerald, a book soldiers carried in their pockets that lovers gave to one another as gifts. Dozens of different editions existed, but the police's routine inquiries to libraries, publishers, and bookshops failed to turn up an edition matching the elaborate typeface on the dead man's scrap of paper. Weeks passed, then months. The book simply never surfaced. Even so, it was at least possible to say this much. The words Tamam Shud came from Khayyam's romantic reflections on life and death, reflections that had moved people for centuries. In fact, they were the final words in most English translations of the book. Hardly surprising, given that the phrase means precisely, "It is finished, it is over, it is done." The last page of a book, the end of a story. At first glance, this clue pointed straight towards suicide, as though the man, as his own final word, had torn this page from a book with his own hands and placed it in his pocket. And indeed, the South Australian police never elevated the case to a full murder investigation. It never went beyond a missing person inquiry. And yet the discovery of Tamám Shud brought the authorities not one step closer to identifying the man. And all the while, after 4 months in storage, the body had begun to decompose. Arrangements were made for a burial, but the police understood that they couldn't afford to lose the one piece of evidence they still had left, the body itself. So the unknown man was first carefully embalmed. A plaster cast was taken of his head and upper torso, in case someone might one day recognize him from it. He was then buried in a specially chosen plot of dry ground, sealed under concrete so that he could be exhumed again if it ever became necessary. As if even the police sensed this story wasn't over yet. Over the following decades, flowers were left on the grave now and then, at irregular intervals, but no one ever learned who left them or why. Like a ghost, like a secret, the flowers kept appearing, and no one ever saw who brought them. 8 months into the investigation, the search for the right edition of the Rubaiyat finally, unexpectedly, produced a result. On July 23, 1949, a Glenelg resident who wished to remain anonymous walked into the Adelaide detective office carrying a book and a strange, tangled story. In early December, shortly after the Somerton Man had been found, he'd gone for a drive with his brother-in-law in a car that was usually parked near Somerton Beach. On the floor near the back seat, he'd noticed a dusty copy of the Rubaiyat. At first, he assumed it belonged to his brother-in-law, but when he asked, the man said he'd simply found it lying on the floor of the unlocked car. He had no idea who'd left it there. Looking more closely, the man noticed that part of the final page had been torn out unevenly. When Detective Sergeant Lionel Lean examined the book, his pulse must have quickened. It matched the tiny scrap of paper found in the Somerton Man's pocket perfectly, down to the edges, down to the fibers. Almost immediately afterward, he found a telephone number faintly penciled on the back cover. Looking closer with a magnifying glass, he made out the faint impression of some letters written beneath it in capitals, as if someone had written something there, then erased it, but left a trace behind. At last, after months stuck at a dead end, they had a real, traceable clue in their hands. The phone number was unlisted, but with patient investigation, the authorities linked it to a young nursing student who lived near Somerton Beach. Reluctantly, perhaps because she was, by then, living with the man who would become her husband, she admitted that she had indeed given a copy of the Rubaiyat to a man she'd known during the war. With some hesitation, she gave the detectives his name, Alfred Boxall. The police were now almost certain they had solved the mystery. Boxall had to be the unidentified Somerton Man. Everything fit. Within days, excited, they tracked down his home in Maroubra, New South Wales. There was just one problem, but it was a big one. Boxall was still alive, and he still had the copy of the Rubaiyat, inscribed with a personal dedication signed Jestin. The book was completely intact, not a single page missing, which meant the scrap of paper in the dead man's pocket had to have come from an entirely different book, from somewhere else altogether. All the police's excitement evaporated in an instant. When the woman was questioned again, she recalled that sometime the previous year, she couldn't say exactly when, her neighbors had told her that an unknown man had come by and asked after her while she was out. When detectives showed her the dead man's plaster death mask, according to what retired Detective G.M. Feltus later wrote in his book, she was completely taken aback to the point of appearing she might faint. She seemed to recognize the man, her face drained of color, and yet insistently, despite the tremor in her voice, she firmly denied knowing him. What remained was the faint trace on the back cover of the Rubaiyat that Lean had found in Glenelg. Examined carefully under ultraviolet light, 5 lines of jumbled, seemingly meaningless letters appeared. The second line had been crossed out, as if by mistake. The first 3 lines were separated from the last 2 by a pair of straight lines with a large X marked over them. In every respect, the message looked like some kind of code. Breaking a code from such a small scrap of text is extraordinarily difficult, statistically next to impossible, but the police did what they could. They sent the message to Naval Intelligence, home to Australia's finest cipher experts, and allowed it to be published in the press in case some member of the public could crack it. It set off a genuine frenzy among amateur code breakers. Hundreds of letters poured into the newspapers, nearly all of them useless, fanciful guesses, and the official, cold verdict from naval intelligence was this: the code could not be broken. There simply weren't enough letters to draw a definite conclusion, though the available evidence suggested the lines might be nothing more than the initial letters of a poem, or something similar, meaning it might not have been a code at all, just a private note to jog someone's memory. The jumbled 5 lines published in the papers quickly captured the public imagination. Mathematicians, retired school teachers, even amateur mystery enthusiasts sent in their own solutions by post. Some claimed it was a love poem, others a suicide note, others still a secret military code. Some tried reading the letters in different languages. Others proposed the letters followed some numerical pattern. None of them managed to convince either the police experts or naval intelligence. Even decades later, cryptologists and amateur researchers would continue arguing over these 5 lines online. Even in the age of computers, this small scrap of paper from 1949 still refused to give anyone a complete answer. And there, for all practical purposes, the mystery sat unresolved for decades, forgotten in a dusty archive box. In his final report in 1958, the South Australian coroner wrote, with a note of surrender, "I am unable to say who the deceased was. I am unable to say how he died or what was the cause of death." An investigation that had run for over a decade closed officially with those 2 sentences. But in the public imagination, the story, if anything, was only just beginning. Over the following decades, dozens of different theories emerged about the Somerton Man's identity and the circumstances of his death, each with its own internal logic, none of them backed by proof. Some suggested he'd been a smuggler, a sailor, or a displaced refugee in the aftermath of the war. Others focused on the nurse, the woman detectives had first questioned, known by the pseudonym Jeston, speculating that the Somerton Man might have been the real father of her son Robin, born in 1947, a boy who bore a striking resemblance to the dead man, who inherited those same distinctive, well-developed calf muscles, and who went on to become a professional ballet dancer. Meanwhile, one of the most popular and enduring theories held, based on the coded message, the lack of identification, and the possibility of poisoning, that the dead man had been a spy. 1948 sat right at the end of the Second World War, at a moment when the Soviet Union was emerging as an increasingly menacing presence on the world stage. And those mysterious, unbreakable lines of letters practically fueled the theory on their own. Retired detective Feltus recalled in a 2022 interview, people believed it was a good lead to follow, simply because of what was called the code. Once no one could work out that string of letters, the spy theory began to take hold. 1948 was the end of the Second World War, and Russia was coming to the fore. Years later, in 2022, the University of Adelaide researcher Derek Abbott, who would eventually identify the Somerton Man as Carl Webb, had himself initially believed the nurse's son theory. While trying to track down Robin to speak with him, he learned that the dancer had recently died and turned instead to searching for Robin's daughter, the probable granddaughter of the Somerton Man, Rachel Egan. In the course of this research, in a twist no one could have predicted, Abbott and Egan fell in love and married. In a 2019 interview with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, Egan joked, "People have said that possibly Derek married me for my DNA, and I think there is some truth to that. It was a strange, almost unbelievable example of how one scientist's obsession with solving a mystery came to shape a real life, a real love story." But here's the ironic part. When the 2022 DNA analysis proved accurate, it turned out that Egan had no genetic connection to the Somerton Man at all. A theory pursued for years was disproven by the very blood running through the veins of the woman the man chasing that theory had married. Announcing the result to the public, Abbott must have felt both a scientific triumph and a strange, deeply personal disappointment. In 2014, Abbott began working with Colleen Fitzpatrick, a well-known forensic genealogist based in California. Together, patiently, they set out on a journey that would take years, identifying the Somerton Man. First, they needed a usable DNA sample, and that was no small task, since the only physical evidence they had was a plaster death mask that had sat on display for over 70 years. A few strands of hair caught in that plaster cast, taken shortly after the man's death, ultimately provided the information they needed. Police had given Abbott these hairs a decade earlier, and a team of DNA specialists at the University of Adelaide had spent years examining them. By the spring of 2022, the Somerton Man's family tree slowly began to take shape. Patiently, name by name, Abbott and Fitzpatrick built an enormous family tree of 4,000 people, and among those 4,000 names, one kept coming up again and again, month after month: Carl Webb. On July 23rd, the long-awaited breakthrough finally arrived. Abbott and Fitzpatrick had found DNA matches on both the maternal and paternal sides of the family. In this sea of DNA cousins, we were able to connect one to Carl's father and one to his mother, Fitzpatrick later told the New York Times. You narrow it down so much that it really could have been any of Carl's siblings. But Carl was the one with no recorded death. 74 years later, the Somerton Man finally had a name. On July 26, 2022, Abbott announced the finding to the world, and the news spread instantly from Australia to America, to every corner of the globe. So, who was this Carl Webb? The man behind the name turned out to be just as sorrowful as the mystery itself. Carl Webb was the sixth and youngest child of a German immigrant family who ran a bakery in the state of Victoria. He was born in 1905. He must have had a quiet, ordinary childhood, one of many children in a crowded house. In 1941, at 35, working at the time as an instrument maker, he married Dorothy Jean Robertson, a 21-year-old podiatrist. They set up a home together in South Yarra, a suburb of Melbourne. But though the marriage looked ordinary from the outside, it was anything but happy within. In March 1946, as Robertson later recalled, she found her husband lying in a wet bed, staring into space, apparently the victim of an ether overdose, perhaps a suicide attempt. After she nursed him back to health over the following weeks, Webb strangely grew violent, attacking her both physically and verbally. That September, unable to endure it any longer, Robertson left the home and eventually settled in the small town of Beauty, 143 kilometers northwest of Adelaide, as if she wanted to put as much distance as possible between herself herself and her husband and her past. In 1951, she formally filed for divorce on the grounds of desertion. The words in Robertson's divorce petition shed light on perhaps the most human, most painful corner of this whole mystery. Webb wrote many poems, most of them on the subject of death, which he claimed was his greatest desire. Think about that for a moment. A man writes poetry describing death as his greatest desire, and a few years later, he's found dead on a beach no one recognizes him from, a scrap of paper reading "finished" in his pocket. Robertson described her husband as volatile, angry, prone to violence, and almost entirely without friends, a lonely man. He had a fondness for horse racing, which led Abbott to suggest that the uncrackable coded message might not have been mysterious at all. Perhaps it was simply the initial letters of the names of horses he'd bet on, something simple, mundane, almost ordinary. The solution, naval intelligence never found, might have been nothing more than a betting slip. Webb also had a nephew named John Keene. Perhaps that's where the Keene or Keene name came from. On the few tagged items in the Somerton Man's suitcase, perhaps the man had borrowed or inherited those clothes from his nephew. Maybe he came to South Australia to find his ex-wife, Abbott suggested thoughtfully in a 2022 interview. We can't say that for certain, we can't prove it, but when you connect the dots, it seems to make sense. The DNA analysis finally gave the Somerton Man a probable name, but many questions remain unanswered, just as they were 74 years ago. How and why did he end up on that beach? Did he take his own life? Did he die of natural causes? Or was he, in fact, the silent victim of a murder? And all those strange, carefully concealed details among his belongings, the cut tags, the hidden pocket, the coded note, what did they really mean? The South Australian police officially acknowledged the 2022 identification in a statement, but their spokesperson carefully noted that the department was still actively investigating the Somerton Man coronial matter and that the final official determination would rest with the coroner. Nearly 3 years on, state authorities still haven't issued any further update. Christy Webb, one of Webb's distant descendants, described the news in 2022 with both joy and sorrow in her eyes as bittersweet. It was happiness. It was joy. But there was also some sadness about this forgotten family member. This was a person. He wasn't just a media hit for a little while and an unsolved mystery. He was our family. Today in Adelaide's West Terrace Cemetery, that old headstone still stands. Here lies the unknown man who was found at Somerton Beach, 1st December 1948. Perhaps one day that stone will be replaced, a real name carved into it. But for now, that sentence, which has stood there for more than 70 years, still greets visitors. People drawn to this story from every corner of the world, enthusiasts, researchers, and ordinary people who simply want to know, who was this man? We honor Carl Webb with respect, the man who died alone on a beach, a stranger no one knew by name. For 74 years he had to exist as the unknown man. Even his headstone read only, "Here lies the unknown man." But now we know. Now he has a family, a history, and now he is remembered. You see, my child, sometimes a life is remembered by the questions it leaves behind. We now know who Carl Webb was, but why he went to that beach, why he cut away every single tag from his own clothes. What that scrap of paper truly meant, perhaps we will never know. Not fully, not ever. Perhaps some stories, just like what was written on that tiny scrap of paper, really ought to remain finished, leaving us only with the reminder that a person once existed, quietly, alone, on a beach. Perhaps each of us one day will leave behind a pile of unanswered questions too. But isn't what matters that someone remembers us, that someone can say they were our family? Good night.